Next up is an exciting panel. It is a group that I get the opportunity to collaborate with and help support. We're going to talk about creativity, inclusivity, and sustainable cybersecurity. Getting it done with DE&I. So I'm going to invite some friends up to the stage. First up, I'm going to invite Sal. Sal is passionate about helping engineers, ethical hackers, and digital enthusiasts understanding the complexity of modern software development. With over a decade of experience building cloud-native machine learning pipelines in healthcare and tech for good sectors, their work is now focused on filling the cracks in open source software supply chain to build better digital future for us all. Come on up, Sal. I invite Christine to come join us. There she is, yay. Christine is a senior director of open source at F5, accomplished product development professional with over 25 years of experience designing and implementing complex hardware and software systems for diverse industries, including social media services, computer-based systems, communication equipment, and business software. All right, Anova? All right, Anova is a photographer, a visual artist, and designer studying business and computer science at UBC Sauder School of Business. She is passionate about viewing technology and business through the lens of creativity to drive change. She focuses in on the impact of the media and open source software supply chain through the lens of art and creativity with multimedia series that interprets the OSS supply chain through the perspective of visual art and mainstream media. Amanda? There she comes. Amanda is the CEO of OpenUK, the UK organization for business of open technology in the UK. Open source software, open hardware, open data with a purpose for UK leadership and international collaboration in open technology. And finally, Eddie. Yeah, here he comes. Eddie is the maintainer of the Finos Foundation, and that explains what it takes to deploy open source software in highly regulated environments such as the financial sector services. You don't need the clicker, right? No. All right, I'll pass that to you.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right. Welcome, everybody. I know it's getting late in the day. If you want to stand up, do a stretch, you are welcome to do that because it's nice to be standing at the moment. So the first question that I'm going to ask everybody on this stage is, when is the first time you remember getting involved in open source, right? When did you get hooked? But I have this right now, which means I'm going to tell you a quick story. I've been reflecting a lot on my own open source journey, particularly being here in Vancouver at this convention center, because almost a decade ago, I was here at this convention center talking about open source for the first time on a stage. At the time, I was working in brain imaging at the National Institutes of Health. We had a lot of resonance. We had a reproducibility department that was working on training everyone across National Institutes of Health to have reproducible computational experiments. Now that was great because a lot of us had access to a supercomputer. So we were getting training that said, hey, here's the ethics, computation, everything that you need to know to have the keys to a supercomputer, be responsible with your cron jobs and your bash scripting, and just don't screw it up. But there was incredibly good advice there. And so I flipped that and I said, hey, isn't this reproducibility training funded by taxpayer dollars? And I said, why don't we flip this model and make it public? So we ended up running a fully open source and free training program where we taught people everything from Docker to statistical analysis. It ended up getting picked up by AWS. We trained 742 individuals to be experts in a cloud computing brain imaging pipeline. But most importantly, and then I will be done, here's what happened. So we ran this on a Slack, but I wanted to signal process this. I'm a signal process engineer. I asked them, we did 10 weeks, an expert every week. I would say, all right, do a pre-recorded video, have a discussion on the Slack, but no one can have identifying factors on their Slack. So we had literally some of the top people at National Institutes of Health. We had experts from Oxford join. We had people from all over the world, but you wouldn't know who you were talking to on the Slack. So it could be a teenager, it could be a high school student, or it could be the head of reproducibility for Stanford, two of which had the most statistical interaction during that Slack, and they didn't know the whole time. So what that did was make sure that what we were signal processing for on the internet was a good idea, and that was it. So in a field, which is computational neuroscience, where statistically speaking, we only have 17% female representation in my course, which was AWS funded, we had 52% female representation. However, 33% of those were postdocs. We're talking people that at that point were 10 or 15 years above me in my career. When I further looked into that, it's because I had created an alternative pathway for them to demonstrate their expertise, and deeply valuing the fact that every week I asked the experts who were blind to it at the time, what was the most interesting conversation you had, and what was the most interesting unanswered question, what was the Slack handle for that? And 9 out of 10 of those weeks, it was a female. Why? Because they're just exceptional geniuses? No, because we created a structure where the best ideas were valued. That is my idea of doing exceptionally good DE&I. Now, the people on the stage today have a lot of different approaches to it. We're going to talk about all different types of DE&I, some versions that you might not consider. Interdisciplinary DE&I think is super valuable. Now, I've had this long enough. I'm very excited to be here. This is a very good panel, and let's talk DE&I. So that's how I got started with open source. How about you? I'm going to start with you.
I don't know how to work this. Oh, it's been on the entire time. I was the problem. I don't remember the question, but that's part of the reason I'm here. I represent the neurodiversity, the people who hide their differences inside the skull. What was the question for real, though?
How do you remember getting started in open source?
This is way too close, but then it's too far. First, involvement with open source would be consuming it for absolutely sure. Linux, Python, everything, just everything, right? The first time that I really found success outside of just publishing stuff to GitHub, which is stage 2. First you use it, then you blindly throw it onto the internet where nobody will ever see it, and then some of us are lucky enough to actually get involved with the community. And for me, that was because a supervisor got tired of sitting in on really boring meetings where people would just talk about doing work all day and never actually do it. And he was like, "Hey, Eddie, you wanna go sit in on this meeting for me?" But then my impulsivity kind of started to shine, and I started just unmuting in the calls and being like, "Hey, we've talked about that 3 times already. Is anybody gonna do it?" And they're like, "Wait, who are you again?" But yeah, that was my first time getting involved, and I actually am maintainer for that project now. That was 3 years ago. You did it correctly.
There we go. Now mine is on. So I'm Amanda. I'm the CEO of OpenUK. I was a lawyer for 25 years and stopped being a lawyer 5 years ago. I also am neurodiverse. I have diagnosis for ADHD. I'm very ADHD and ASD. And I guess I'm female and I'm a little bit older than a lot of the people in this room or who I interact with day to day. And I can't code. So why am I here? Funny enough, in a way, getting involved in open source for the first time in my life felt like I was somewhere I belonged, which may not say very much about all of you. And it was just the sort of environment. I guess I didn't know I was neurodiverse and people were very accepting. And I know that's not always the reputation that open source has had, but I've always found that I've been in an environment where I've been made welcome and made to feel like part of a very strange family with a lot of issues. But it's my family and I've been part of it. And I joined 15 years ago when I became general counsel of a company called Canonical, which was an accident. So I joined them for 3 months, ADHD. So I joined them for 3 months and then I was going to go to Amazon to work on an electrical retail product, which I guess would have been the Kindle, which might have been quite interesting. And when I joined Canonical, I had worked in the OEM space before, and nobody else had. So they were looking at putting Ubuntu onto the Dell environment, and that was the first thing I worked on. And I suspect I was the only person that had ever encountered that OEM space within the Canonical team. But I just unexpectedly really got into open source. And that, you know, as somebody who'd come from a corporate, commercial, legal background, who was a tech lawyer, was not expected. So the value set for me was the thing that attracted me.
Christine, and the reason, well, I guess my aha moment of an open source was I actually joined the open source team at Facebook, and when I did so, it was with a mind to kind of just see what all was going on that was interesting. But my aha moment was when I actually saw the maintainers really get excited about the work they were doing above and beyond what they would have to do in their regular job. And seeing some of these maintainers just go out and reach to mentoring other people in the community. And I just saw the possibility of where open source could find people who that's just their very first type of fix, and now they are a maintainer of a big project. So I just kind of fell in love with the open source, having the potential of people just coming in and actually getting started from wherever it is. And if you find that right community, it can actually like catapult you into like a career that you didn't even know was possible. And because if you find the right people again, you'll find some very welcoming people. And a shout out to Joel. Joel Jones. Yeah, Joel was one of the folks who were also at Meta Facebook with me, and he was like one of the folks who's like a very kind individual, and that's what I think is the aha moment, is the kind folks in the community of sometimes misfits.
Hello. Hi. Anova, and I am a computer science and business student. I'm very new to open source in this conference's sense, but a bit more about my background. I suppose I've been in an open source art background for longer than the duration of the conference so far. So I first got into computer science and my interest in coding because of Open Processing, which is a JavaScript framework that allows you to create cool visualizations. And that is sort of what sparked me to actually pursue a degree in computer science and learn more about the technology and overall open source software space. So I bring that kind of diverse mindset. And yeah, super open to learn about open source.
Yeah, I think it's cool because, Anova says they're new, but I've been working with Anova for over 3 years. They have some open source experience. Not working, I'm saying volunteering in open source. We met for the first time yesterday. Hey, I love open source. In person. So I think what's interesting is like there's a lot of, we understand the sentimentality of open source at large, but I think it's really important to understand, I take a little bit of issue and concern with the idea that all that we need to do to improve cybersecurity right now is better tooling, because that misunderstands the situation that we're in. I do need better tooling. I also need better players, because what you have to understand is we are not going to SCA our way out of these problems. If you really understand cybersecurity very deeply, then you understand that what you are doing for any given language, there are a discrete set of executing options that can be compiled, right? So it's like playing chess, but for every language, every different architectural decision that you make choices around how you're going to define the board that you're playing on with an adversary, right? So I need not just better players in cybersecurity, not just better researchers, I need people that are better at building securely, right? Build a better way to play chess against your adversaries, because you can control the board. So I think coming to that note, I think it does take a really specific personality, not just for open source, but for cybersecurity, because it's adversary driven. So in this space, what does it mean to be we're reaching out, developing new communities, new partnerships, so that we make sure we have enough players on our side to win the game.
So I think that you start by looking at the landscape, and the landscape is very different from what many of us are used to in open source. And we are looking at a combination of different levels, I suppose, whether you're looking at governments and public sector, whether you're looking at enterprises and end users, and trying to map that landscape and understand where the balance is, balance of use, balance of power, where risk will sit, where risk and liability will shift, and where that will all go is a very complex picture. And the risk we have is that the people who make those decisions will not understand open source. And they had some very informed people talking about that government interaction on the stage today, but we can see from some of the legislation in some of the countries that people who are making those decisions and having influence don't have that deep understanding. They don't get the nuance, and very simple nuance like describing something as commercial open source, which you all know doesn't exist, versus open source being used commercially is huge. And I think that the thing this community brings as a whole is deeper expertise and lots of different kinds of expertise that need to go into that ecosystem, because you are dealing with a diverse understanding, a diverse ecosystem of people with all sorts of different levels of understanding. And that's going to be hugely important. So having those who are able to translate to those different levels of ecosystem is going to matter. And part of that translation process in itself requires a diverse group of people, even from the starting point.
So where you ended there is saying that to solve diverse problems, we need diverse contributors.
Well, it wouldn't be a bad start, would it?
All right, that's what I heard. I'm going to go with it. Something that stands out to me is that we, as humans, tend to generally accept and welcome the things that are most familiar. The things that are comfortable to us, or the things that are similar to us. And that's just default humanity. But when we have complex problems, and when we have the sheer volume of attackers that are rising, right? You said 742 contributors. There's 742% on the slide earlier. It's like, oh, playing a numbers game here. Right, there's just a huge percentage of rise of attackers. And now, a couple weeks ago, we published an article, Abernathy published an article, where they were finding like actual evidence that ChatGPT was used to create malware that was successfully executed and completed an attack. It's written with ChatGPT, right? Shocked face. Yeah. Sarcastic, shocked face, right? But like, we are now there. We're on the other side of what we kept saying was going to happen. And so we have a huge number of increasing attacks. We have people being able to automate the creation of their attacks. And so it's becoming substantially more important to what you said, that we're actually equipping people to show up to solve these problems. And if we stick with our basic human nature of staying in our comfort zone and welcoming and receiving the people who communicate in familiar ways, we are going to be cutting out a massive number of contributors.
The other thing that was actually interesting, somebody was telling me a story yesterday. I didn't get all the details right, but they were saying that this game called Go, that used to be like the computers were really good at doing better than a human, but suddenly they found other people were beating the computers now because they're just going at it from like a completely different and erratic way of doing things that's just like tripping up the computer. So there's like this new and different way of going into battle is sometimes what you need, instead of, like, as he's saying, just doing the same thing over and over and over again is probably not going to work. And where are you going to get some of the new ideas? You're probably going to get it from like the people who are thinking differently from places that you did not even consider. And so I think that's why diversity is to your point, is going to be helpful in just trying to get ahead of this battle.
Yeah, well, so I think it's interesting. I mean, the reason why I'm very excited about this zine, which I'm not plugging, I'm just saying is very cool. And Anova will explain to you this right here, because we're still, oh yeah, I thought we were out of time. Hey, well done. Okay, but this right here, Anova will explain this very quickly, but I think this demonstrates something about social media and the fact that we are using non-official pathways to disclose and to patch vulnerabilities. It's being driven by social media, and Nova can speak to this. When I'm speaking to diversity, I think, you know, from my perspective, I have to go out and individually help to advise tribal nations right now because I can't get them to come into this room. And if you're not very familiar with tribal nations were mentioned almost 17 times in the last report from the United States, right? They are a fundamental network. We, as the US, you've got CDNs that are interacting between two nation states in that space. They've got the same security concerns, and we don't do advisement with them. And it's a really interesting space. I wish we did, because tribal nations are like either the world's smallest countries or like some of the world's biggest businesses, and they function a little bit as both. So they've got really severe cybersecurity concerns. And if we were doing diversity right, we'd have tribal members represented in this room, because you know what? Their infrastructure runs on Kubernetes too. But on that note, there's something that I really want to cover. So we're going to start with Anova and then Amanda. So I want to talk about looking at diversity as interdisciplinary. Part of why I care about this is because one of my degrees is not just signal processing, but political science with a focus on human rights. That helps me a lot to be on this stage and to care a lot and be reasonably informed. So interdisciplinary intersections in open source need to happen. And Anova's going to talk a little bit more about how that helped them to discover what they did.
Yeah, so I can quickly explain the visualization that you see before you on the zine. This might be very confusing or interesting to begin with, but this was a data visualization and originally an art piece I created using data scraped from Sonatype's State of the Supply Chain report. And particularly it was scraped the data about enterprise response speed in relation to media and press popularity. And this was not, internal in the OSS community, but external media, social media, and external stakeholders that aren't necessarily involved specifically with the community. And most notably, on the right side, the warmer pinks and reds represent a higher percentage of not vulnerable versus the left side is cooler. And this represents a lower percentage of not vulnerable, which is also reflective of a lower enterprise response speed. So on the right side, some people might be familiar with log4j, log4shell. That is the vulnerability, the library that I visualize on the right side. So something that got so much media attention actually sparked a much quicker response speed, which I'm sure this is not news to anyone, but I thought it was very interesting to visualize it in a new way. And this definitely has informed a lot more of the practices I've made throughout the zine, as you can see after this panel. Yeah, so that kind of gives an overview of what has been informing my art and what is interesting and appealing to not just, for example, developers, but also media and artists and anyone else who might be interested.
That's the interdiscipline part.
Yeah.
The art is one discipline and the security is the other discipline.
Indeed.
I understand now.
One of my favorite interdisciplinary intersections, of course, is law and open source, but I have nowhere near the expertise as Amanda Brock. So I am interested to hear your perspective, particularly on how are we getting a new generation of legal experts involved and engaged in this space?
So I guess with OpenUK, which is the easiest thing for me to talk about, is what I've spent the last 3.5 years doing almost nothing but. And I suppose in some ways doing it through lockdown was actually easier because there was an opportunity to build a digital organisation and a focus. And I suspect that any of you looking in at OpenUK from anywhere else in the world sees something very different as an organisation. And I suspect that part of that is because it's female-led. And I suspect part of it is because it's interdisciplinary. So we have the engineering community that we bring together. We focus on the leadership, assuming that they bring their communities in the geographic areas with them. And that we have the engineering, but we also have law and policy. So we held our first conference back in February, 7th and 8th of February. And it was very unusual. And it was unusual because we had conversations on the stage that brought together engineers and policymakers and academics and lawyers into the one conversation. Because I personally am a really strong believer that everybody ought to be hearing these same conversations. And I think we were quite privileged. I think we were the first people to have the White House on the stage. We had the former digital director from the UK government and a UN director talking about stuff together. It was really interesting. So the audience, though, wasn't your average because it was such a mix of different people. And I think that's reflected in our organisation. We have never tried to make diversity a separate thing. What we've tried to do is keep it at the heart of everything we do, and the same for sustainability. And we now have an organisation that's over a third female. I don't know all the stats, but if we look at the conference, it was 49.3% of the delegates weren't white. And this is the UK. Yeah, well, we can quibble about 0.7%. Yes, it is half. And that's in the UK, where our ethnic mix isn't the same as the US, right? So it was pretty good going. And we had nearly between 30 and 40% of the audience was female. 44% of the speakers identified as female or non-binary. So we shifted it, and we shifted it, I suppose, in a very clear and calculated way by making sure that anybody from the start could see people like them as much as we possibly could. And my experience of open source is that once you get through the door, and I was accidentally shoved through it in Canonical, but once you're through the door, people are really warm and friendly to you. But working out where the door is, let alone how you get through it, is the hard bit. So we really focus on bringing people in, and as we find people, gathering them together. That's a very long way of coming back to, that includes lawyers. And recently, we have an election in the UK next year. So we've started to focus on policy people who understand politics, because I don't, who can help us to learn about how we interact with those politicians for the election next year. But all of those people across that ecosystem have to understand the same stuff, right? And they all come at it from different places. So my view is, rather than sort of discriminate across the conversations, we bring everybody into one conversation and they each add whatever it is that they have that's special to that mix. And that mix creates very different outputs. So, you shake it all up and you get a fantastic cocktail. And that's how it's worked for us, and it's worked quite well. I suspect the model is very replicable, and it would work anywhere else too if you wanted to do it. But people have to be engaged, and to engage them, generally you need stories. So we focus very heavily on our reporting and bringing open source to life in ways that people understand. So this year we're supposed to be doing a case study with McLaren from Formula One. That's really sexy, everybody loves that. We've got a catering company. We've looked at a fashion house before, and we found real life examples that are really relatable to engage people, because they all know they use digital. They don't know they use open source. And then once you start to explain things to the ecosystem about that reuse, about removing lock-in, about the ability to contribute, about skills development, exactly what you were saying about skills development on the job. I mean, those things are critical. And that's, to me, what shifts the needle.
How much time do we have left? Oh, great. So I'm gonna give us one question, then I'm actually gonna open it up for any questions on the stage and see if we can get a little bit more of a dialogue going. Because I think we've got a lot of expertise on this stage that you're not necessarily gonna see again all on the same stage, and we can get some really interesting questions and answers out there, especially on best practices for your developer communities if you have questions. But there's a question that I do want to ask everyone here, and you can answer one of two questions. Number one, what is the advice that you would give to someone who is just starting out in open source about what they can do and what the future of open source is going to look like? Or, because I think it might be different language, what advice would you give to someone who's been in open source for 15 years or more about what the future of open source looks like?
Real softball question there. Well, I'm not about to predict what the future of open source looks like, but I think if we want to bring about the future that we need to be intentional about it. And so that's something that I was really excited about, because like you're coming at this from like, hey, cybersecurity for open source, but let's like make sure that we are making this conversation about diversity for this little minute right here, because misunderstandings, prejudgment, not being aware of prejudice, not realizing when we're being insensitive. I think you can kind of see the trend with the list that I'm trying to make right now. Insensitivity to other people's experience, refusal to listen when somebody tells you that they're experiencing something different than you. These are the things that are preventing the future that we need. And if we want the future that we need, we have to be intentional about not repeatedly hitting those obstacles. Now, because of our human nature, those obstacles are in front of us. Those obstacles are not going to go away. But by opening up the conversation, by trying to empathize a little bit, which, fun fact, is like the hardest thing for ADHD people to do, because we're so caught up in our freaking heads. So a lot of times we're the most guilty culprits of that insensitivity, because we're so caught up in our heads that you say something that I did not like your joke, so nothing you're going to say the rest of the day is going to matter to me at all, right? I point at you because you make the most jokes. These obstacles are in front of us, and if we want to have the future that we need, whether you're just starting or you've got the car keys in your hand and you're the one who is really driving us forward in that future, we have to pay attention to what we're doing, how we're talking to each other, and how we're thinking about each other.
That's now on, yeah. So I'm going to give you an either or in terms of the future of open source. The future of open source is either going to be non-existent and proprietary, which I think is a true risk, or it's going to be very different from the room I'm looking at now. And if the future is going to work, it's going to have to span geopolitical shift. It's going to have to span massive changes across the planet. And we are going to have to be resilient to the interaction between governments and that geopolitical shift. And we're going to see countries, emerging markets, we're going to see countries that don't really engage in tech right now taking real leadership. And that means that in 10, 15 years' time, this room will look a very different color. And it will have a very different future, or it will have no future for me.
Loving the optimism.
I'm not going to touch the future.
We don't like your questions,
I know, it's a softball one.
No, it's easier to answer the question about how to get involved. I remember going back, and I was going around the world, and I was told, okay, if you're going to go around the world and talk about open source, you got to go to all of these different countries and ask the question, why are you not contributing more to open source? So I went to talk to a lot of people, and they said because we're not as smart as the people who are actually on those projects, and we don't feel we have anything to offer. And I was obviously quite shocked and very saddened by that. But if you fast forward, this was about 5 years ago, you fast forward today, those areas are now the fastest growing open source contributors. So what changed between then and now? It was just like they got access to a lot of open source projects and used it as a place where they could actually start learning and becoming developers. And when they couldn't get people to come to their conferences, they set up the conferences themselves, and they became the experts of what advice would I give to somebody who's getting started. You have to create the future that you want to see. And sometimes you have to be brave enough to do it, and you could be stumbling, but that's the way that you can actually come. So it can be really scary to just get started in open source. That very first pull request, are you doing the right thing? Are you going to upset somebody? Are you going to look dumb? I don't know. Sometimes it's very hard. And the answer to all is yes.
Yeah, you're going to look dumb, you're going to piss people off. Yep.
Yeah. Just keep going, and sometimes you just get that one person, and then that person pulls somebody else and mentors somebody else, and it becomes a community. But sometimes you have to be the first person who finds that door.
I can also stay in the present. Just coming from my perspective as a student in undergrad, I think a great way to get people more involved in open source is to educate and actually have awareness about the open source community in these spaces where we are looking for opportunities to contribute. But I, as a computer science student, we've never really touched open source in our coursework or in my university events or community in general, which I found very strange because of how important and critical it is to infrastructure and business and just, like computer science, like communities and all of our products that we use in general. So I do find that quite worrying almost in higher education, just from my perspective and my experience so far. So I think a great way would just be introducing open source as a concept in spaces, which I would try to do through our first iteration of the Cyberscape scene, which I'm very open to feedback from the audience on how to improve and what you'd like to see next in the future. And just 10 minutes. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'd like to also just introduce some of my aspirations and goals with the zine and how you as the community could also contribute. It'd be amazing to have this as an ongoing and an evolution that does not end here at this conference, but continues and documents and communicates the work that the open source community is doing on a larger scale and a very interdisciplinary scale. It'd be cool to have it not attached to a specific organization, but stay with the developers, the maintainers, and the community as open source is. And have it evolve as an art piece, but also a way to deliver information and communicate work, resources, and have it be an accessible way for people to just learn and be interested in the community. That was a long-winded answer, but I hope that that helps.
Yeah, I mean, I always find it really interesting to get, one of my passions is like getting people involved in open source and like throwing little, like, have you ever thrown a PR party? It's like the most fun thing. So raise your hand if the first time you submitted a PR, you were nervous, right? Everyone in this freaking room, right? Why is that? It's because we don't respect the fact that in a very real way, you're having a one-to-one relationship with the technology, whatever platform you're using, and a social network sitting on top, and we don't identify or recognize that. And there are so many cybersecurity issues with that tied in intersection of a social network that can't be removed from the platforms we have. Halo effect is a highly exploitable psychological property of the human mind that we have issues with in cybersecurity. And I really think that the future of cybersecurity is seeing that, recognizing that, and we are going to have a much better understanding of what the layers of information processing are on top of what we traditionally just consider technology. It's this interaction of a social network and technology. In 10 years' time, with an influx of different cultures and different communities, we're going to see something really different. And it is going to be fully globalized. The work that we're doing at OpenSSF to make a multilingual approach, making sure that it can be read in any language, I think that's fascinating. And I guess my one note here is, last year at OSS, I was, making some comments about how much I love how CNCF has that glossary where there's all kinds of different languages and we're learning how to do different terms in different languages. And I lean on that to try to do talks in Spanish, but I cannot say vulnerabilidades, so I stopped doing that. So I was talking about how this has really helped with globalization and getting people into open source when they just are getting online in their own countries. And someone raised their hand and we're like, can you repeat what that was? I haven't heard of that before. Turns out I was talking to one of the maintainers of the Linux kernel, right? So when we talk about how differential the social networks sitting on top of these essential ecosystems are, and why it is so different participating in these different types of social networks, and how we have a really great opportunity being is that all these networks sit behind user interfaces to look at and evolve the way that we use the structure of the internet to have better interactions and to favor excellent ideas and not whatever bias you came to your computer with that day.
Sal, I think there's a point that Anova raised that we should go back to, and it's something that I've seen a lot of, which is that we're teaching young people computer science, we're teaching them to code Rust, we're teaching them to code Python, but we're not teaching them how to contribute. And continuously, we meet young people in the UK, and I assume it's the same everywhere in the world, where they would quite like to, but they just don't know how to take that first step. And I think there needs to be a much bigger focus that we all take responsibility for and engaging with them.
Yeah, and I know one time I went down to, I think it was the University of somewhere in California, and I just did, okay, let's all get our laptops together. It was a university, and we're going to all do our first PR. And I used to do these roadshow first PR type of things.
It's a PR party. There's so much fun.
It was a PR party. But yeah, but it was and they were in a university, and they were in their third year, but they had never known about open source or even just tried open source.
Yeah, and I think there's another space beyond universities that we see, and again, I assume this is not a UK thing, where we have a huge population of immigrants who are never going to get to university. They're first generation, but they're in code schools, and they're again being taught their future is as engineers and developers, and they're working their way through that. And again, they're not being taught, even at that level, how to contribute. So we have this massive audience that just needs a little push through the door.
Hello. So traditionally, when people talk about contributing to open source software, they talk about contributing code to open source software. And while this is getting better recently, I still feel like there's a hierarchy of contribution where code is top tier contribution. Those are the most valued people. And all the other things that open source software needs to succeed are lower than that, although, like I said, it's getting better. My question for the group is, what sort of strategies have you seen be effective at valuing things like documentation contribution? We need graphics designers, we need UX designers, all these different, we need 50 things I can't all say here to make this succeed. How do we get those people to contribute in a world where we still mostly prioritize code as being the top tier contribution you can make? Thank you.
Yeah. So this problem is easier the smaller your project is, right? So OpenSSF scorecard has very few contributors. If you know Golang, start going to those meetings. There needs to be more community there, right? Kubernetes does not have any hunger for more pull requests. There's lots, right? And so there's a very wide spectrum here. But I think that to your question, like how do we make it easier for people to make just contributions, like there are typos in the Kubernetes README every now and then that crop up, and somebody like me should be able to just pop in, right? Somebody like Anova should be able to just pop in and be like, hey, there was a typo. Here's a pull request with a fix. But the gap is that there just aren't enough people to triage and respond and figure out if this is correct with those really, really big projects. And so what my project does is we allow maintainers to elect more maintainers, and we allow reviewing maintainers to just like pop in there. Argo CD, actually, the entire Argo project is really good about equipping people to just do reviews and contribute in that way. And I think that is something that every community should be talking about. And at the Kubernetes level, that may just be something that they can't deal with. But for those mid-sized projects, I think just having that conversation about like how do we make it easier to contribute, that's the starting point. Just talk about it.
Another thing that might be interesting is sometimes where is it that the rewards or the recognition is happening? If it's on GitHub, sometimes if you're, say, into documentation, you're like, okay, GitHub's too complicated. It's just like too complicated for me to even just contribute documentation and written. So maybe even just like the infrastructure where people contribute and where the recognition happens, we need to think better about that, because I think that's also tricky.
I guess I've spent quite a lot of my life not being able to code, contributing to open source. And Jim mentioned this morning, we've got a book signing at 5:30 downstairs. And there's a 640-page book that I've read 5 times. I've actually read it more than that because I had to read each individual chapter, edit it, submit it, and then I had to do the edit 5 times. And I suspect I'm the only person who'll ever do that. But it's a body of knowledge that is super valuable to open source. So I'm going to sort of say that I think we can contribute without being coders in a way that adds value and that matters. And I think we just have to own the fact we do that. But also, you need to engage people. They need to want to be part of something. It needs to appeal to that age group. It needs to attract them. It needs to have something about it that they feel there's something in it for them. People are not entirely altruistic. And even if that's just hanging out with people that you like, or a conference t-shirt, or, you know, and have some respect for them. And I think that engagement takes a lot of work. It doesn't just happen. People don't just rock up and form a community. You have to make it something they want to be part of, make it something that's particularly attractive to them, not to you, but to them, which is a very different thing. And I think that's the way you get the skills. And, you know, for example, I've got a UX designer coming in to help OpenUK. And it was a word of mouth thing. It was somebody who has that skill, who wants to be part of the group. They want to be going to the events we do. They want to be hanging out with the people that we network with. And that's, you know, that engagement is really important, I think.
Yeah, just on that note, if you are a maintainer, here's my advice to you. Number 1, start thinking of your project in terms of your Maslows, right? Like, images are great. Security is your fundamental, right? Number 2, your contributor file should say, here are the things that we're focusing on in order of your project Maslows. Like, we welcome these kind of contributions, and say we celebrate these kind of contributions, particularly focusing on the non-code executing contributions, getting those people engaged. I highly recommend also hosting once a month or once a quarter, right, a PR party where you can help them come in and say, all right, if it's literally your first time inserting an image in a GitHub, we can walk you through that the first time. Now you've learned how to have your first participation. You've had a direct engagement with a maintainer. It really, when you're looking at the sociology and the psychology of this, having a first person interaction, even if it's in writing, and having that within the first 48 hours significantly improves the chance of having a second and tertiary interaction. So if you want stable contributions, it does require meaningful engagement. Now, I also know large projects that do some of that very personalized engagement through chatbots now, which is fine because they're having to handle hundreds a day, but it is having that semi-personalization that makes a difference. But really do highlight, and when I say celebrate, I mean celebrate. Like, celebrate those really interesting contributions. Yeah. All right, that's about it. Thank you all so much, and thank you all.